I beg to move this House to now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Mrs. Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to thank the House for allowing me to hold this debate this evening in relation to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty, Professor Philip Alston's statement following his visit late last year to the United Kingdom, which, along with a plethora of other reports, has ensured that the grinding and increasing poverty of daily life for so many in the UK has been brought into the spotlight. Unlike the government, who've treated Professor Alston's well-evidenced and thorough statement with complete and utter disdain, I want to personally thank him for his conviction in passionately highlighting the absolute shame, degradation and harm that this government is inflicting on those they govern, that's led to 14 million people living in poverty. Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for allowing me to intervene. In addition to the disdain which this government showed to the UN Rapporteur's report, the United States also showed the same disdain when he produced a report on poverty in the United States. And I know we have a special relationship with the United States, but I think it shames us all that we share that disdain. And I wonder if my honourable friend would agree with me on that.
My honourable friend points to a very worrying analogy, and I of course do agree with her. His statement confirms that what many of us on this side of the House have known for a very long time, that when it comes to welfare reform and this government's policy agenda overall, the evidence points to the conclusion that the driving force has not been economic, but rather a commitment to achieving radical social re-engineering. It has long been embedded in Tory DNA that there is no such thing as society, and social experiments in rolling back the state always begin with those who need the state the most. That is why the legacy of every Tory government is one of deep inequality. He rightly notes that nowhere more clearly can this social re-engineering be seen than in the rollout of universal discredit, as he calls it.
We're going to really give way?
Of course give way.
I thank you for giving way and congratulate her on bringing this matter to the House for consideration. With reference to the report which highlighted the alarming rise in food bank use, in my constituency, the Trussell Food Bank has had a 20% increase in their take-up over the Christmas period because of benefits. Those benefits are debts due to delays in first universal credit payments, leading to people forced to choose between paying rent and feeding their children. Would the member not agree that perhaps the Minister, and being respectful to him, must take steps to address the issues highlighted within this report? Can't be ignored.
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and they are points that I will be coming to later in my speech, and the honourable member is right. This cannot be ignored any longer. In principle, universal credit seemed to make some sense. Consolidation of 6 benefits into one should have achieved the key tenets of simplifying payments and incentivising people into work. Crucially, however, it was never designed to get support to those who needed it in a timely and efficient manner. Because in reality, like all welfare reform measures from this government, it was about creating a hostile environment and demonising and dehumanising benefit claimants. As Professor Alston notes, the Department is more concerned with making economic savings and sending messages about lifestyles than responding to genuine needs. The result has been an unrelenting onslaught of abject harm inflicted on over 3 million people. The late-in-the-day news that the next phase of rollout is being scaled back gives no comfort to those millions already suffering. Trussell Trust food bank figures alone show that in areas where universal credit has been implemented, food bank usage has increased by 52%. That the Work and Pensions Secretary states she regrets the growth in food banks will offer no comfort to the estimated 8.4 million people in the UK suffering from food insecurity, or to the volunteers and the faith groups filling the gap left by the state and manning the nearly 2,000 food banks we now have shamefully operating as a permanent part of the welfare state. Nor will her regret give comfort to people like my constituents, such as one 18-year-old girl starting out in life who unexpectedly lost her job, and who, despite statements made by this government to the contrary, has not been eligible for housing cost assistance through universal credit. She narrowly escaped homelessness thanks to the intervention of our irreplaceable South Tyneside Citizens Advice Bureau. Her regret also won't help my constituent who suffers from mental health difficulties, who was left with only £1.25 per day to live on after the department made an error with her payments. Madam Deputy Speaker, the 5-week delay embedded into the system, which often turns out to be longer, was never going to achieve anything other than hardship, because one day going hungry and not being able to pay your bills is one day too many.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
In my constituency of Combe Valley, there are nearly 6,000 children living in poverty, and in one ward, 40% of those children are living in poverty. Would my honourable friend agree with me that in one of the richest countries in the world, that unnecessary suffering brought about by government policies is unacceptable?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I do agree with that. The 35 days delay leads to absolute destitution and despair. There is no acceptable rationale for making people wait this long, other than, to use Professor Alston's words, to make it clear that being on benefits should involve hardship. This hardship is exemplified clearly in the draconian application of sanctions. Right across the benefits system, over an estimated 350,000 people between 2017 and 2018 were denied access to benefit payments for the most trivial and minor of reasons, such as missing an appointment because a relative has died unexpectedly, or because they themselves have been admitted to hospital, or for some attending interviews instead of job centre appointments. The list is endless. Professor Alston's statement also pays attention to the 2017 Government Transformation Strategy, where all government services will be digital by default. Universal credit claimants have been used as guinea pigs, as this is the first major service to be digital by default. It is either deliberate or total incompetence that led this government to the conclusion that the most vulnerable, those with limited digital literacy or lack of access to computers, should be the first to test this. Even worse, this has been done against a backdrop of library and job centre closures, the very places that those struggling would have went to for assistance. This government have also created a disability culture based on ignorance, void of medical evidence, fabrications and downright cruelty. The most damning policies of our time, the work capability and personal independence payment assessments, where companies like Maximus, Atos and Capita are handed multi-million-pound contracts to hit targets based on how many people with disabilities they can push into destitution, have seen people with Down syndrome being asked by assessors how they caught it.
I thank my old friend for the good speech he's doing, but with my old friend agreeing with you, it's shameful that the UN, often associated with its development work in the third world countries, has found that 14 million people in our own country, Great Britain today, in 2017, of the government's failed welfare reforms. Would my honourable friend agree that the government should be ashamed of their findings on this UN report, as it demonstrates that increase we only see in this country as child poverty, food bank usage, homelessness is a direct result of their own policies. So would my honourable friend agree with me that it is unacceptable for a government to ignore the findings of the UN, both in terms of poverty and the treatment of the disabled people in this country?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and the government should be ashamed. They should also be ashamed that a wheelchair user with multiple sclerosis was asked how long it would be before she could walk again. A young woman with cancer-related bone marrow disease was denied personal independence payments because she had a degree, because apparently working to gain a qualification is a sign that somebody isn't really disabled. On top of this, people with disabilities are losing their severe disability premiums and enhanced disability premiums under universal credit, leaving them £80 per week worse off. Of course.
Thank the honourable member for give way. And can I congratulate her on bringing this debate to the House on this very important issue, which I feel has been shamefully neglected by the government up to this point. But just in relation to the comments she was just making, would she agree that the use of informal observations in benefit assessments, which have no criteria and are very open to subjective opinion and interpretation on the part of assessors, has very often resulted in inaccurate and very ill-informed assessments, causing certainly some of my most vulnerable constituents considerable distress? And so does she agree with me that then a review of the use of those particular types of observations should be undertaken by this government?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I do agree with her that that would be a welcome way forward. But these stories aren't the exception, they are the norm. So it's little wonder that in 2017 the United Nations concluded that the UK government was guilty of grave or systematic violations of the rights of persons with disabilities. The UK benefits system right now locks people into a Kafkaesque nightmare where for some the only escape has been to tragically take their own lives. This state-inflicted damage cannot and must not continue. I used to be proud. Of course I'll give way.
Thank you very much, and I too congratulate my honourable friend on bringing this debate and on her very powerful speech. Would she agree with me that the description of the welfare state system that we now have, where people are left utterly powerless to and without the support that they need often to appeal the decisions that are made, is contributing not only to rising levels of debt, but also to rising mental health problems as people suffer depression and despair because of their lack of ability to get on and to be treated fairly?
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she is right. I used to be proud we lived in a country where people, through no fault of their own, when in need, were able to receive help in their darkest of hours from the welfare state. But since 2010, that safety net has been eroded and ripped away so that work is no longer a route out of poverty. Punitive welfare reform, benefit cuts, inaction on low-paid and insecure work, as well as the widening gulf between the cost of living and income, has led to 4 million people in work and in poverty. 4 million children living in poverty, where stories of children coming to school with grey pallor, undernourished, rummaging through bins for food and wearing threadbare clothing are commonplace. What comes through very clearly in Professor Alston's report is this government do not have a vision for this country that works for everyone. This statement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the full report that will follow in the spring should be treated as a factual commentary and a warning for future general elections of how Tory governments rip the very fabric of our country apart and cause irrevocable harm. 8 years of regressive policies have led to the hollowing out and decimating of local government and many other key public services, meaning that costly and expensive crisis management as opposed to prevention is now the norm. The human cost is one we are seeing being borne out in our streets, where homeless people are dying, where people suffering from terminal illnesses, disabilities and mental health difficulties are being wrongly declared fit for work, some attempting to take their own lives, some being successful, where children and adults are being admitted to hospital for malnutrition, where food banks are having to turn desperate people away because they cannot cope with the demand, where families are living in squalid temporary accommodation with only the clothes on their back and no end in sight, where vulnerable adults and children are being left with no social care provision at all, and where a whole generation of women have been plunged into poverty after their pensions were stolen from them by this government. Madam Deputy Speaker, this short debate in no way does justice to Professor Alston's report, but I do hope we will be able to revisit it in the future, because as we debate here tonight, there will be mums and dads returning home after a hard day's work with rumbling stomachs, looking through empty cupboards, wondering how they'll feed their children. There will be elderly people sat alone, the silence of their loneliness piercing as they wonder should they eat or put their heating on. There will be thousands who've teared open that brown envelope this morning only for the words and decisions within it to literally tear their world apart. Their pain lies at this government's door. Their suffering should be the shame of this government, but it isn't. Madam Deputy Speaker, Professor Alston noticed the striking disconnect between what he heard from this government and what he consistently heard from people across the country. He added that the government has remained determinedly in a state of denial. He said that poverty is a political choice and austerity could have easily spared the poor if the political will had existed to do so. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, when responding to these points, I do hope that the Minister will answer this one pertinent question, one that millions of people currently suffering need to know. Does that political will exist yet?
Minister Justin Tomlinson.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for South Shields, who I know has done a huge amount of work in this area over a number of years and brings a huge amount of experience to many of the points that she's raised. And this report does actually cover not just the DWP, but it reflects on the DC, HLG, Treasury and DEXU. But here I will be speaking predominantly from the perspective of the DWP. And at this stage it is only an interim report, and we are committed to considering very carefully his views and opinions. Now, I recognise that honourable members would now expect me to disagree with the majority of the report as it stands. And there are certainly things that we don't agree with, but I do support the important role of the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. Myself, the former Secretary of State, other departmental ministers, our respective teams were fully engaged with the process. We met with him, we supported the visits and the engagement throughout that process, and as I said, we will give very serious considerations to the views and opinions that he's brought forward. And I, as a minister, I'm not precious. Government should be challenged. We should be held to account, whether that's the UN Rapporteur, whether that's stakeholders, or the fantastic work that the various select committees do. All governments of all political persuasions, since the dawn of time, have had challenging reports. It's rare that we get a report that says, fantastic, you are single-handedly doing everything perfectly right. And it's an important part of our democratic process. And even those most challenging and most critical reports do ultimately shape future decisions. I won't do too many because I've got a lot to do, but yes.
I thank the Minister for giving way. I'm a little confused because the Prime Minister and the Secretary of State have both said they dismiss these findings and do not agree with the report. Has there been a change of thinking between their comments and the Minister coming to the dispatch box today?
Well, what I'm saying is we will consider them seriously. We obviously don't agree. We don't agree with all of them, but there are important views and opinions that he has highlighted that rightly we should be looking to respond to. One challenge I will have back to him ahead of his final report is that two of the visits to Newcastle and also the visit to Clacton, where he had the opportunity to meet with frontline staff and volunteers. And at the recent Women and Equalities question, the Honourable Member for Clacton expressed a huge amount of disappointment from those frontline staff and volunteers who felt that their work, their fantastic work that they do, wasn't recognised. It had just one line, and I do hope that in the future report it's right to hold the government and us, the ministers' feet to the coals, but I think we would all recognise that there are people who do a fantastic job. That's both the paid formal staff and the volunteers across, and I do hope he would reflect on that. And as we consider his views and findings, we must remember that it is a snapshot. On many of the issues raised, we are rightly already taking action, acknowledging that there were issues and that they needed to be dealt with. And that's either through the additional money secured in recent budgets or our ongoing and crucial work with stakeholders with their particular expertise. And as I said, whilst this covers many departments, I will focus on where the DWP has the lion's share of the involvement. Now, understandably, UC was a significant part of both the report and the speech that we've just heard. And to be absolutely clear, this was never a financial thing. We are looking to spend an additional £2 billion compared to the legacy benefits, rightly so. UC offers the opportunity for personalised tailored support, dealing with housing, training, childcare, and giving the claimants who are in a position to seek work at an additional 50% more time to find work. And actually, if you visit the job centres, and whilst there are still challenges and there is much more work to do, the actual frontline staff do recognise that UC is significantly better than the complex legacy benefits, which were 6 benefits across 3 agencies, HMRC, DWP, local authorities. You frankly had to be a nuclear physicist to navigate them. We all know from our own constituency casework how complex it was to unravel the situation. I'll do one last one.
Sure. Just to say that in my constituency office, I'm just about 100 yards from the Social Security office, as close as that. I've had numerous people coming out of the Social Security office, coming into my office looking for advice, distressed. And I think, Minister, and I've written to your department, maybe not to you directly, but to your department, just to outline some of the things that we feel should be changes that should be made. And I'm just asking the Minister, in light of those things, maybe there needs to be more done in the Social Security office to address the issues early on.
I thank the honourable member for Stratford, and I'm coming to those. It dealt with the fact that there was, for some, an effective 90% tax rate, the well-documented 16, 24 and 30-hour cliff edges, which were significant barriers for people, and the fact that it was so confusing and complex that we believe £2.4 billion worth of claims went untaken each year across 700,000 claimants, some of the most vulnerable people. My role within DWP is to represent vulnerable people going through the benefit system, and it was often those who were missing out on money because simply they were unaware that they were entitled to the support that we all rightly wanted them to have. Let me make a little bit of progress, and I might, if I've got time, because I'm conscious the person who secured this debate has raised some important questions. I want to try and cover as much as I can in the limited time. If I can, I'll come to you. There has already been much-needed improvements, partly through the additional £4.5 billion cash boost that's been secured over the recent budgets, the changes to advance payments, particularly to actually make it part of the discussion at the initial conversation, changing the repayments from 6 months to 12 months to 16 months, and at the rate that they're done. That's something we will continue to review. The additional non-repayable 2 weeks housing benefit worth up to £237, and the recent announcement for an additional 2 weeks of ESA, GSA or income support worth up to £200. We scrapped the 7 days waiting, the alternative payments in terms of direct to landlords on housing or more frequent payments where we feel that will help. The additional £1,000 extra work allowance worth £630, that alone was £1.7 billion. The 12-month exemptions from the minimum income floor for the self-employed, and the increases for the severe disability premium from £158 to £326. However, there are areas where we still need to do further work, and in the speech for the talk about the digital by default, and I think we do need to look at that. We do have in place alternatives, but I think we also need to be more proactive in recognising those who would need that support. We've got to identify vulnerable claimants, and I think it was a major step to put in place a formal arrangement, something I had championed, with the citizens' advice. They will remain independent of us, they are widely respected, and they are best placed to give support, particularly to vulnerable claimants, not just with the digital side, if that's needed, but the general support as they navigate the benefits that they should be entitled to. And building on that, we have to make sure that stakeholders are absolutely key and at the heart of everything we do in terms of training of our frontline staff and providing support for claimants. So, for example, just before Christmas, the month before Christmas, I was working very closely with Women's Aid, Refuge and Mankind, meeting 3 and 4 times so that they could do a root and branch review of the training that we do to help identify potential victims of domestic abuse, that they could update our training manuals and guidance, that they could feed in the feedback they get from their supporters, and then look at the best ways that we can identify potential victims, refer them to the maximum number of local and national support organisations, and to work on the level of support that we can offer. And that is a principle that I would like to see formalised. So it's not just because it's a topical issue now, it's something that's a given going forward, and then looking to do that in many areas. Now, there was lots said about in terms of poverty measures, and what is the reality out there. And what we do know is there is 1 million fewer people in absolute poverty, which is a record low, which is 300,000 fewer children. On the different measures of relative, absolute, before and after housing, all are no higher than 2010 and 3 are now lower. And the average income of the poorest fifth in society under our government is increased by £400 in real terms. I'll do one more.
The Minister for giving way. Does he agree with Professor Alston's assessment that because the government uses 4 different measures of poverty, they can essentially say what they want about these figures? The reality is there's 14 million people living in poverty in the UK.
Well, the honourable member's just used one of those stats. And actually, we recognise that, and this cross-party work on looking at alternatives, and we are very interested to see if there's a way we can find statistics that we can all agree in. So I think actually that's one area we all do agree in. And the richest fifth are £800 less well off under this government. So we are targeting the support rightly at those that are most in need. And household incomes have never been higher, and income inequality has fallen, having risen under the last Labour government. Now, also, many people referred to food banks. Now, food affordability, the ability to afford a meal, has almost halved in the last 5 years, down to 5.4%, which is 2.5% lower than the EU average. There is still more to do in that area, which is why I am committed to working a lot closer with the food bank network in this country, because for a variety of reasons, some people may be going to food banks who should be getting formal support, and I want to make it as easy as possible to identify, to refer, and get them back into the system so they can get their full support. Well, the Honourable Member shaking hand, I do not understand why anybody would not want to do everything within their power to identify vulnerable people within society and give them the support that we want to do. And going to the very heart of the question that was raised by the Honourable Member was, is there a will from the government? That absolutely is, from myself, from the government, right through. We are going to keep on working with all of the stakeholders, the partnership organisations, to make sure that those in most need in society get the support that they should do. We are also looking at the areas of homelessness. Rightly, we've put an additional £1.2 billion, building on the principles of duty to refer. And we have some exciting pilots, the Newcastle Trailblazer, partnership working led by Crisis, that have had some really positive findings, and the Housing First initiatives in Manchester, Liverpool and the West Midlands, again on the principles identifying, referring and support. Exciting developments from those pilots, and those will go to the very heart of future rolled out support. And the key for me, with my own individual role within the Parliament, is really sharpening up the tailored support, whether that's with care leavers, ex-offenders, the parental conflict programme, making sure those who need that extra support that many of us in our lives were able to take for granted is then a given for all people, to unlock everybody's potential. And some of the areas that I felt were missing from the report was also looking at education and attainment to unlock people's potential. I went to school, bottom of the league tables, two of my best friends went to prison. And actually, it is absolutely key, if we can, regardless of people's background, make sure that we give them the maximum opportunity to succeed. And I wholeheartedly support the significant improvements that we are making in education. Yes.
Thank the Minister for giving way. As a former head teacher, I talk to a lot of my former colleagues, and many of them of a morning are washing children's clothes, giving them breakfast, having to give them extra lunch because they're starving. Does the Minister agree with me that this is totally unnecessary and inappropriate if we were caring for the most vulnerable in our society?
That's why it's absolutely right that we have targeted support at the poorest in society, which was why the poorest fifth are now £400 in real terms better off than they were under the Labour government, and we will continue to do that work. It is why we have prioritised, by having sound financial management and a strong growing economy, we've been able to deliver record employment in every single region of the country. That wages are rising the fastest in a decade. We've introduced the national living wage, the income tax threshold changes, the UC childcare up to 85%, worth up to £15,000 to parents with 2 or more children, the doubling of free childcare. These are all priorities for this government, because we recognise, regardless of background, everybody should be supported. Everybody has their own, treating them as an individual in a simplified system that can give that tailored and personalised support. So regardless of their own unique challenges and opportunities, that we can unlock their potential. This, as I've said, is that many of those findings and opinions are ones that we have to take seriously. We are doing a huge amount of work, and we will continue to do it. And I thank the honourable member for raising this very important issue this evening.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as that opinion, say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. I beg your pardon. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order.
Order.